Recently, I had the pleasure of talking to cognitive neuroscientist Ev Fedorenko. She is the head of EvLab, her own language lab at MIT. Their mission is to understand how minds and brains create language. In this interview, we speak about the language architecture of the brain, adult language learning, and the difference between thought and language. This is an edited version of our interview. If you would like to listen to the full version, you will find a link down in the description box. I hope you enjoy it. Ev Fedorenko, thank you very much for your time today.
My pleasure.
I was wondering, I just want to ask with a really sort of simple and direct question that I know that a lot of people have. Is there a language organ in the brain?
Organ is a loaded term. Organ is something that may imply something like innateness. So what we know is that in an adult brain, so once your brain is formed and you have acquired language, there is a set of brain regions that are exquisitely specialized for processing linguistic input. They don't work at all when you process complex mathematical expressions, when you listen to rich and complex music, when you observe others' actions and try to make inferences about what they're thinking about, and so on and so forth. So they really seem to just be driven by linguistic input, either visual or auditory. At that point, it doesn't matter where it came in. And so what we can say with quite a bit of certainty now is that in a well-formed brain, there is a brain network that is specialized for processing language, and it really seems quite selective for language. Now, how the system comes into place, we don't know much about. And there's a lot of debate. There's a big divide between some people who think there's some innate predisposition for language, and at some level, this kind of a hypothesis becomes almost vacuous because it's kind of by definition true, because humans but no other animals acquire language. So then it's not a very interesting testable idea. But the question is whether there is something that's specifically there to deal with language from the start, or whether it's something that whether it's a communicative system that we can acquire through pretty sophisticated learning mechanisms that we know humans have. And I generally align with a kind of letter view. I think we're very good learners, and we learn all sorts of complex things from the environment. So I think it's quite plausible that we can also acquire this communicative code through our interactions with conspecifics who use that code, which is mostly our parents early on, people who are raising us.
You've sort of discovered that there isn't actually just one part of the brain that's responsible for language. It's spread across various areas, right?
That's right. So it's a network of areas. Again, it's when people, I hesitate to use the term distributed, because sometimes when people use a term like distributed, it kind of means not localized anywhere in the brain at all, and it's kind of across the whole cortex. The computations are somehow all doing something to do with language. It's not quite like that. So there is a pretty restricted set of brain areas, and you can find them in each person. You can find them very easily in just a few minutes of scanning if you're using functional MRI or MEG or something like that. And these areas respond robustly and selectively to language, but it is a set of regions. So it basically, and it's a network that comprises some areas in the left frontal cortex, so kind of going along your left frontal lobe, and then along the lateral temporal cortex as well. And it's left lateralized in most individuals, but almost everybody has a right hemisphere homologue that responds in a similar way, but just much, much less. So it's kind of not as good a version of your language system in the other hemisphere. That's kind of the typical architecture. Now, in some people, it's lateralized to the right. That does happen. Happens a little bit more often in left-handers, but not so much more often. And some people show very bilateral responses. So it's really kind of hard to say. And if you didn't know, it didn't have the clues of which hemisphere is which, you couldn't tell by looking at the strength of activations. And some of these differences may be functionally relevant. We and others are investigating these kinds of questions, but yeah, but that's basically it. There's a network of regions, mostly left lateralized and very specific for language.
Yeah, so the areas that you know are responsible for language. What kind of other things do they do apart from language?
Well, they really don't do anything. I mean, they really just do. They do language comprehension and production. They're engaged to some extent in production, although in general, production is less well understood than comprehension. It's quite a bit harder to study, so fewer people, fewer labs study production. But with respect to language comprehension, it seems that these regions show sensitivity to both individual word meanings, but also combinatorics, so putting words together into phrases and sentences. Because when you're interpreting a linguistic utterance, you basically, you can imagine kind of a mental lookup that you're doing for all of the bits that you're recognizing in the input, right? This is a word I know, this is a construction I know. So you're looking up all these bits that you have stored over your lifetime experience with language, but then you also have to figure out how they all go together. And according to some proposals, there are separate parts of this language network that do this kind of stored meanings function as opposed to the combinatorial function. And in our work, we just don't seem to find support for that separation. It seems that any brain region that is involved in combinatorial processing cares very deeply about word meanings. And that story, even though it's contradictory to many current proposals of the neural architecture of language, it aligns very well with current linguistic theorizing, where it's not just the case that all nouns and all verbs are the same, but how we combine words is very highly dependent on the specific properties of individual words. And so there's no sense in thinking about very abstract rules like, oh, a noun combines with a verb. Instead, what we seem to be doing is keeping track of very, very particular kinds of combinatorial rules where this particular noun can only combine with these verbs but not these other verbs. And so it makes sense that kind of processing would be actually tightly integrated, the knowledge of words and how they combine. And that's what we seem to find across many approaches.
I'm just wondering about what you think, what the implications might be for people who are trying to learn a language. Like if we know that brains store language maybe more as kind of big chunks or sort of patterns, would it be better to study language by doing that rather than sitting and trying to memorize grammar rules?
Yeah, grammar rules and individual words. That's a very good question. So language learning is not exactly my expertise. We dabble a little bit in these questions through some of the projects, but there is an idea that I think is gaining some ground, and if you talk to language acquisition researchers, I'm sure they will fill you in more on this. But the idea is that some of the advantage that so basically let's like ground things out, right? So one key difference between a kid learning a language and an adult learning a language is that there seem to be some things that are harder for adults. Like, it's not hard for adults to learn a large vocabulary. They can do that in a foreign language. But things that seem really hard are things like learning the sounds of the language. So you often have an accent if you learn a language as a non-native person, and you often have some difficulties with grammar. Right, so those two things. Now, an idea that's, like I said, gaining ground is that perhaps kids have an easier time with grammar precisely because they don't divide the input up into words when they first encounter speech, right? It's actually very hard from the acoustic input or visual input if you're a sign language user, right? It's very hard to put boundaries among words. And so what you get are these continuous chunks of material, linguistic material, which often is in the form of phrases or, constructions, if you will. And things like, for example, subject-verb agreement will come as a unit within that chunk. Right? So instead of having to memorize a separate rule that if I say a singular noun in English, I have to add an S to the verb if it's a present tense verb, you kind of get this chunk, and eventually by getting enough different kinds of chunks of that time, you may be able to draw that generalization out from these stored units, as opposed to this very analytic strategy that adults apply when they learn a foreign language, where they learn words and then they learn rules separately, and then they try to combine these two sources of information online, which is really hard and demanding on not just memory but also online processing. And yeah, so that's one idea that's out there. And I think so having talked to some language acquisition researchers, they'll often say that when they share that information with people who teach people foreign languages, they say, oh yeah, of course, we've known this. It's very helpful to learn to teach people in these chunks where they don't maybe necessarily even know all of the composition of what that chunk is made up of, but they memorize these larger chunks of material, and that can be quite helpful. So apparently some of these ideas have already permeated the applied side of things, even though on the theoretical side, I think there's still a lot to work out about how exactly the memory mechanisms work here and the learning works.
All of the people that I talk to, even polyglots who are not really too interested in the science of language, but there's a lot of people who say that input is so important, like massive amounts of input. But I also realize that that can't be the whole picture, because there are plenty of people who, like for example, heritage speakers who have all this passive language, but they're not able to speak it. And there's plenty of adults who are really comfortable reading a book, but they can't have a conversation. So, I'm sort of conflicted about, obviously input's important, but output also has to play a really big role in towards fluency, right?
Yeah. I mean, you're asking very good, deep questions. I mean, so it's certainly, I think most people would agree that the set of knowledge representations that we have when we know a language are shared between comprehension and production, and yet there are really striking differences between people's abilities to use it in the comprehension way, which is kind of a more passive process, if you wish, perhaps. Like if you know a language and you hear a conversation, you kind of can't help but map it onto these representations. Sometimes you really wish you could zone out and not hear it, but if somebody on the bus is, you just listen to it, you can understand it. But production is this much more kind of effortful, goal-directed behavior where you're retrieving these chunks of knowledge and then putting them together into phrase and utterances. And you can kind of see these things go hand in hand in various aspects of human cognition. Like, for example, in kids, production always trails comprehension. So kids can understand a lot before they start saying words or putting words together. So that's, a harder task that comes in later. And in aging and in various disorders, production is typically more affected. Like a lot of comprehension. In fact, comprehension abilities seem to keep improving into quite old age, like into the 70s and 80s. You keep being better and better at being able to extract meaning from linguistic utterances. But a lot of the production aspects of production start suffering, like remembering specific words or remembering, how words are used in specific contexts or something like that. Like that can start suffering as you age, even in a healthy aging situation.
Yeah, well, I'm actually wondering, because you've spent so long kind of looking at people's brains, especially the brains of, people with aphasia, so like problems with language production or understanding. I'm wondering if you have any insights into why people's language abilities can differ. Like it's clear, especially if you're a language teacher, that some people are just better at learning languages than others. I mean, do you have any ideas why that might be?
It's a great question. I mean, the why can have many different layers there, that why question. The one thing to say is that we don't have great measures for assessing linguistic ability in adulthood. So there is a lot of measures that exist for developmental linguistic abilities, and there I think there's some evidence suggesting that, for example, girls are a little bit ahead of boys in their developmental linguistic abilities, of course. And then we have tools for assessing linguistic decay, like in disorders, stroke aphasia or degenerative aphasia. But one big question is, how much stable variance is there among typical adult speakers? Most measures that exist are just not that great. They either load very much on the general IQ, so measures of vocabulary that are used in tests like SATs and GREs, they correlate very strongly with IQ, suggesting that they're not quite tapping whatever is special to language. And so we and a few other groups are trying to develop better tools for measuring that. And then once we have good tools for assessing your language competence, we can try to relate that to, for example, on the one hand, your general cognitive abilities, to see if some other aspects of your cognition may or may not be predictive of your linguistic abilities, but also try to relate them to neural variability, because as I briefly alluded to, we see some stable variability in the neural architecture of language. And one big difference is with respect to how lateralized responses are. And as I said, in most people, they're quite strongly left lateralized, but in some people, they're quite bilateral. And this kind of variability is bound to be important, because in every developmental disorder that has ever been studied, I think pretty much every single one, you find more bilateral language responses. And this is not just for language. It's not just for things like dyslexia and autism, where linguistic or communicative problems occur, but also for things like schizophrenia, which is not traditionally associated with linguistic problems, or epilepsy, which is a very generic kind of disorder. And in all of these disorders, you seem to find these more bilateral responses to language, suggesting that something goes not quite right early on in development if you're prone to a neurodevelopmental condition. And that leads to this more bilateral language representation. And so kind of a reasonable hypothesis is that having these more bilateral responses may make you somehow less good at some aspects of language. And some people have argued this. I think the evidence is not kind of rock solid yet. So I think there's more work to do, including in developing better measures just of the typical population's abilities. But there's also something to think about, which is there's many ways in which you can be better and worse at language, right? Some people are really fluent, no disfluency making speakers, right? They just produce these incredibly fluent productions. And other people may have vast vocabularies because perhaps they are avid readers and they've just accumulated these massive amounts of linguistic knowledge and how words are used in particular contexts. And other people may be able to acquire new form meaning mappings, like polyglots, right? They take a language and they learn it, and they take another one and they learn that. And it seems easier for them, or at least enjoyable compared to many other people, to do that. And different components of language may well the variability may well be separate, one, and may have different underlying causes. And I just think there is no answers yet. And so that's one area where I'm excited to learn more about in the next 10, 20 years.
Yeah, and well, that actually sort of brings me onto my next question, because you've actually published a paper which was which asked this exact question with Rosemary Varley, which is language and thought are not the same thing. And I mean, this is a fascinating question. And I often tell my students that rather than sort of focusing so much on the specifics of language, you know, it's a great idea to first develop your kind of ideas and your ability to, you know, express yourself. And those kind of things are kind of independent of language in a way. So do you think that's kind of fair, what I'm saying? Or
so, I mean, I think, and again, I run into this also with students when they write papers, right? Clear thinking cannot be fixed by the quality of your writing. If you're not thinking clearly about a problem, even if you use the right construction, the right words, the paper is not going to be good, right? So basically, what makes so everything bottoms out in thinking process in some ways, and language you can think of as just kind of a code where we can translate thoughts into to share them with each other. But a lot of the thinking can happen very well even when language is not accessible to us, which is what happens in these severely aphasic individuals, which sometimes instead of having damage to just a small part of your language system, as commonly happens when you get stroke and then consequently aphasia, sometimes you have a very large stroke or sometimes other forms of neural damage, and you lose kind of your whole language system. And if that happens in adulthood, you're severely linguistically impaired. And yet, if you probe these people's ability to think in all sorts of ways, they seem to be totally fine on this. And that is contra quite a few views from philosophy, old views where complex thought is just not possible without language. But we can see that that's just wrong. At least in the adult brain, once all the machinery is in place, you can take this ability to convert thoughts into this code that allows us to share things with each other, and thinking can proceed just fine. Now, there's a different question of whether language may be necessary to get some of these thought capacities into place developmentally. And there's at least some evidence suggesting that in the domain of sophisticated social reasoning, language may be important for developing kind of a full-blown social cognitive ability. But in other cases, it's less clear. But regardless, in an adult human brain, thinking and language seem quite separate. Of course, they have to interface, right? I mean, there have to be links between particular words and expressions and more abstract meaning representations, but they're certainly very separable as well, and you can probe each independently.
Yeah, and as well, I think it sort of leads into the whole question about language and culture, which is something, really fascinating to me, because, obviously a child who's born in 2019 in a kind of modern country, they just through the act of being born, they acquire all of this knowledge, like, they acquire knowledge about how technology works, and so it's sort of like, well, obviously you don't need language to think, but there are obviously certain types of thinking. Like if you want to talk about philosophy, for example, they're concepts that were invented by generations of humans before us, and we sort of took all that language and we use it to describe very specific things, right? How important for you is the kind of combination of language and culture?
I mean, I think of language as fundamentally embedded, and it's very hard to think of language outside of the context of human culture. I guess this all ties into the question of why and how we came up with this sophisticated ability to share thoughts with each other and what drove this. One common evolutionarily hypotheses are just impossible to seriously evaluate, right? Because we can't go back and see how, but people try to come up with clever paradigms to do this. But basically one common idea is that we needed to transfer knowledge, right? We got more sophisticated in our tool making. We started being able to kind of, preserve meat, do better hunting, better farm, all of these kinds of abilities that were relevant to survival at the time. And as that knowledge accumulated, it became quite important to pass that on to our children so that they can survive, and so on and so forth. And so within that hypothesis, it's certainly kind of culturally very grounded. You're coming up with a sophisticated communication system so that you can preserve knowledge, which is, shared knowledge is ultimately what culture is in some way. I mean, people have very different definitions of culture, but basically it's our experience in a society, right, in a group that we live in. And so it's, again, coming back to a strong divide among some people who think language is kind of biologically in there. We come in with something that is there to learn language. I think we certainly have brains that differ from other species. How exactly they differ, we don't know. A common story is that there's some circuits that specifically evolve in humans to allow for things like sophisticated linguistic processing. It's not clear. The evidence for that is not clear at all. One thing that we know happened is a huge scaling in the association cortices. So basically, very simply, you can think of the brain of the cortex as made up of sensory perceptual areas that deal with things like basic visual, basic auditory, basic tactile perception, and so on. Motor cortex that does the control of our various effectors like eyes, hands, other limbs, and so on. And then a lot of the rest is what people refer to as association zones. So these are kind of flexible parts of the cortex that presumably do whatever else is left behind besides the low-level perception, low-level motor output, which is a lot of thinking, a lot of social cognition, a lot of language. And so something about our brains is different, but I would not be surprised if we find out eventually that the only thing that's really truly different is the size of these association zones and the plain number of cells that we have to be able to encode vast amounts of information. And that's very different from the idea that we evolved a separate circuit or a particular brain region that can do, say, complex syntax. And now the arguments that people will give against the simple scaling ideas, they'll say, well, look, dogs can learn words and parrots can learn words, monkeys can learn words. And it's true, but there's orders of magnitudes difference in how many words they can learn. And that is a non-trivial difference. Like, people kind of think oftentimes that a difference in scale, quantitative difference, is not necessarily that important, but I think that's misguided. And in fact, Steve Piantadosi and I wrote a paper a few years ago where we showed that a system where you are able to have a vast enough number of communicative signals, you can have things like combinatoriality emerge as a kind of byproduct. So you don't necessarily need to start out by building in a sophisticated structure building machinery a priori. Instead, by simply expanding the space to store these communicative signals, you may be able to have that system evolve a property like combinatoriality.
So sort of after all the years that you've spent, studying language and studying the brain, what advice would you give to somebody who's trying to learn a second language as an adult? Is there anything that's sort of really clear in the science, that works, what doesn't work?
That's a very hard question. I mean, there's certainly a strong argument that many people have made for immersion. So saying that, just learning from books and manuals and classes is just not quite enough. And to make some big leap, you really want to be in that environment. I'm honestly not on top of the literature that very carefully in a controlled way evaluated these different things. But it seems like there's that wisdom shared among the language learning community. It also seems, so we worked a little bit with polyglots, and one thing that stood out to me quite strongly is that, I initially thought that they would be a much more homogeneous population. There would be something similar about how they all learn languages. And the diversity really, really struck me, because it seems like there's minimally kind of two phenotypes among the polyglots, where one kind of people are these incredible extroverts. They go to markets where multiple languages are spoken and just strike up conversations with random people, which to me seems totally terrifying, but extroverted people can do that kind of thing. And then they start, so they're really good linguist users. So field linguists are really good at that, as you just start trying to communicate without knowing anything about that language and gradually pick up on some common words and then try to kind of bootstrap your way out. And then there's other people who are total book nerds, and they maybe don't go talk to anyone most of the time, and they just sit there with their grammar manuals. And maybe the kinds of competence that they acquire from these different ways of learning is quite different. Like, maybe people who learn through more conversation and interaction with other people, maybe they would be much better at producing things, right? Being able to kind of fluently output things. And people who are learning, sitting there buried in grammar books, they would be able to maybe produce things, but in a written form, or understand things really well, and write things with no grammatical errors, but not have a fluent conversation with someone. I don't know. I think there's a lot of questions about second language learning that are still remain to be studied. And one thing that I've been really wanting to do for a few years now, and maybe I'll still get to it, but there's only so many things that one can focus on at a time. But one thing that I've wanted to do is set up this online portal for polyglots, or at least for people who, I wouldn't put a boundary of what, for people who seem to have an easier time learning languages, and then trying to at least cognitively characterize this population to try to understand, is there something in common? To the extent that there's multiple strategies, what are they? Do they lead to different kinds of outcomes to the extent that we can measure them with the kind of cognitive tools we have? So I think there's a lot more actual research to be done on what makes language learning work. But I think one thing that's likely to be true, given what I've learned so far, is that there's likely to be more than one way, which I guess is always a lesson in life. It's not like there's one very clear path to success in this area. I think there's going to be multiple strategies, and different things likely work for different people.
So one final question, because you've devoted, most of your life, all of your professional career to studying, brain and language. Why do you think that languages are important?
It's an interesting path for me. It has been an interesting path. I mean, I guess I started out thinking that there was much more of a closer link between language and thought. I used to be kind of the mind that a lot of complex thought really requires language. And like I said, that may still be true in some developmental accounts, like to get certain forms of thought into place may require language. But it seems like in an adult brain, they're really separable. And so in some sense, it was I wouldn't say disappointing, like science never disappoints, but it was quite surprising to me how much complex thought could proceed when you take away the ability to express these ideas linguistically. So there's kind of that angle to it. But also, I just really enjoyed languages since I was little, even before I started, when I started learning English a little bit early, and then I was learning French and Spanish and German, and I just really liked seeing patterns. Like, I'm a very analytical type of person, and I liked seeing commonalities and differences in how languages come up with ways to solve, certain problems, like conveying that those two words relate to each other or something like that. And that was just really pleasurable. And I actually, I was just telling a colleague here that when I was little, I didn't know cognitive science existed. Like, that's just not something you knew as you grew up in the Soviet Union. There wasn't like a field of study. And so what I thought I would do is I was going to start a company, and I was going to try to teach languages in families, meaning in language families. So instead of teaching people French, I would teach them all the Romance languages at once, or something like that. So develop a system that would leverage the similarities. So that was like my plan as of 10 or 11 years of age. That was like my great idea. And I still think there's something to that. I mean, I think I think that's somebody maybe should at some point pursue that, and it may be fun. But then I got to college, and I took a class in the psychology of language, and I was like, wow, people actually study how we process language, and they seem to like be able to do that full time, and that just was remarkable. And so then I was like, okay, I definitely want to do that. It seems like a cool problem we don't understand. And like, to understand something, you really want to be able to build a machine that would do this. And I don't so much care about building a machine that can say do machine translation or something, but I certainly want to understand things at a level so that somebody can build that machine. And we're very far from that yet. We're getting some hints here and there. We're placing some constraints on theoretical spaces about language, but a long way to go yet.
Well, Ev Fedorenko, thank you very much. I've learned a lot. It's been super fascinating, and thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure. It was fun talking to you.